Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. When the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in August 2021, the governments in Central Asia must have expected relations with their southern neighbor would become more complicated. 4 of the 5 Central Asian states engaged in a dialogue with the Taliban, hoping to reach an understanding that would preserve their own stability and possibly keep Afghanistan open as a potential trade route. Only the Tajik government chose to treat the Taliban as a threat and kept its contacts with the Afghan militant group to a minimum. More than a year and a half later, these relations are developing and evolving, and right now, new understandings are being reached, especially with the border states of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And to discuss all this, I am joined by Salimjon Aioubov, the director of RFERL's Tajik Service, known locally as Azadi, Farruh Yusupov, director of RFERL's Turkmen Service, known locally as Asadlik, and Alisher Sidikov, director of RFERL's Uzbek Service, known locally as Azadlik. Thank you all for joining me. And Salimjon, I want to start with you. I mentioned the Tajik government publicly has been displeased with the return of the Taliban to power and has largely avoided engaging with Taliban officials. But this week, a Taliban delegation visited Tajikistan. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a Taliban delegation arrived in Tajikistan, how to say, of course, with the permission of the Tajik government, however, without, let's say, diplomatic entourage of those visits, they entered Tajikistan with the commercial visas, business trip visas, but not diplomatic one. And they were in Dushanbe. We don't know if there was any meeting between the Afghan delegation and the Tajik authorities, but then they arrived in Khorugh, the center of the Gorno-Badakhshan autonomous region, and there they met with some officials of the local government, and also visited the consulate of Afghanistan, which was destroyed by avalanche early February. And it's looking like the Tajik authorities are not commenting, are not either confirming or denying the visit. Some of them off the record confirming that the Taliban people were there. So it shows that the relationship between the two sides in a kind of in a time of change.
And this is the first time any Taliban group has shown up in Tajikistan since August 2021. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's correct. When they arrived in Samarkand, some Tajik journalists rushed to Samarkand to see a live Taliban because this visit is the first one when Taliban, at least claiming they officially visited Tajikistan, but the Tajik authorities are not denying or confirming that. So it's a beginning of new era of relationship, I think.
Okay, and sorry, just one last question because I want to make this clear for our audience. The Tajik government is the only government in Central Asia that I know of that has not sent any delegation to Kabul to speak with the Taliban since they came back to power. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. Even there was no high-level meeting between, for example, Tajik ambassador and some high-level official of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs so far. At least we don't know. At least it was not on a media. And there was a lot of problems between the two sides because Taliban accused Tajikistan of supporting a northern front led by Ahmad Massoud, and there was a conflict on the American aircraft left by the Afghan Afghan army in Tajikistan, and also there was a lot of at some point they threatened Tajikistan with some consequences if the Dushanbe will continue interfering in internal affairs of Afghanistan. But now it's looking like the first good sign was when both sides agreed to continue export of electricity from Tajikistan to Afghanistan during last winter, and they signed an agreement. But the agreement was signed by the commercial organization of Afghanistan, not official, not state entity. And the Tajik authorities said that they are caring about ordinary people who are suffering during the winter and so on. But now they are keeping silent when a lot of questions is going on the social media. That what does it mean? Is it mean that you already started negotiations with Taliban, and it means you will not support a Tajik minority in Afghanistan, and so on? A lot of questions and no answers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if relations between the Taliban and Tajik government seem to be improving, there are complications further downstream, and I'll start with you, Alisher, because you're the first country downstream along the Amu Darya. The news of this canal, and it's not really news because the Taliban started digging a canal in their section of over on their section of the border last spring, but it is 100 kilometers long now, according to them, and it's starting to make a lot of news because they're going to take water from the same river that Uzbekistan uses to get its water for crops down in that part. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how that worked out? And it seemed, all of a sudden in February, it seemed like this big surprising story. Even though, like I said, the construction started about a year ago. What's the attitude in Uzbekistan toward the Taliban digging this canal, which they say is rightly, they can do this. It's their right because they need the water for agriculture, just like Uzbekistan does.
Thank you, Bruce. Initially, Tashkent's position towards Taliban government was pretty amiable, unlike Tajikistan. And they arranged lots of visits, lots of discussions and humanitarian aid and reconciliation and peace and security issues. So there's been a number of projects like railroad, also transit of goods through Tajik territory. All these were in discussion, but this new kind of a canal that Taliban government is digging, apparently, seeding a lot of problems between these two countries. Though it was very strange that a couple of weeks ago, Uzbek delegation led by Abdulaziz Komilov, the advisor for foreign affairs of the president of Uzbekistan. So the final kind of talks were under closed door, but the report that came out of this meeting that Uzbekistan offered its help, technical help, to construct this canal. So it's kind of a dubious messages we are receiving from this. So on one hand, we absolutely know that the canal will reduce the water in Amu Darya downstream to at least 1/3. On the others, and that would affect severely agriculture, the ports on Amu Darya, the fishing and the Aral Sea, the ecology of the region. But on the other side, why Uzbekistan offered a technical help, it remains to be like a big mystery. Whether they have some plan to stop it while construction. So that's kind of a very, let's say, remains in the dark, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Let me just follow up for a second. What's your understanding of the professionalism of the construction of this canal?
What we see like hundreds of trucks loaded and digging. The digging is also being done, according to experts, in some kind of a violation of a digging process. So they're basically using water that will make its way through the earth. So it's kind of a chaotic, lots of heavy machineries, and basically what officials told us, they also sitting and watching this on satellite. And of course, there are a number of high-level top officials who raised this issue, but for some reason, apparently Mirziyoyev's government is too scared or weak to take more like drastic measures to take this under control or demand some kind of standards to be met or stop this. I mean, what we hear is that that would be absolutely not possible if somebody like President Karimov would be in power. You know, President Karimov used to have a huge buffer zone in areas controlled by ethnic Uzbeks in Tajikistan, and I mean, they would go all the way to undo this kind of a canal. But so far, we're not seeing any kind of decisive steps from Uzbek government.
Okay, thanks. Farruh, the Amudarya there's been less and less water in the Amudarya for years. I mean, the proof of that is the fact that the Aral Sea has dried up so much. The Amudarya used to reach the Aral Sea and provide water to it, and it's many years since the Amudarya actually reached the Aral Sea. Can you describe the situation in Turkmenistan, which is the end of that river, the Amudarya? What's the agricultural situation like in Turkmenistan now?
Yeah, in Turkmenistan, Amudarya is the main source of water for irrigation in agriculture. There is as you know, Karakum Channel, which derives water from Amudarya, and it feeds all those southern and southwestern regions of Turkmenistan. And in the past 3-4 years, that Karakum Channel, according to our correspondents inside the country, became like a small ditch, as they describe it. And even the Amudarya itself, according to local irrigation specialists, the water level dropped by more than 60% in the recent several years. And as a result, Turkmenistan wasn't able to fulfill, the state quotas for wheat production, cotton production. In the past several years, they haven't been able to fulfill those state quotas. And of course, there are other problems too. They use water irrationally. As UN, I think, a couple years ago estimated that, by the way, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, the level of irrational use of water reached critical point, they said. So there are a lot of problems. And of course, this new channel in Afghanistan, which Taliban, for some reason, is able to dig out so quickly. According to the satellite images, at least 50 or 60 kilometers of that channel has already been dug out. So that's causing a lot of concerns among the farmers in Turkmenistan, because they hear that it's been built, but not by concerns by the government, because government pretends as if nothing is happening. Unlike Uzbekistan, which at least has made some efforts to negotiate with Taliban and offer some technical help, and probably that technical help will mean that there will be some sort of a deal on how to use the water resources. Turkmenistan hasn't done anything. And that's because, as Alisher mentioned, that the government in Uzbekistan is weak. Probably Turkmen government is even weaker and is petrified to counter anything that Taliban is doing. As you know, Turkmenistan has been in contact and trying to appease Taliban even before August 2021, before Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, and they are quite wary of Taliban in Ashgabat. So those concerns by the farmers are legitimate, because already that downstream of Amudarya in the Lebap region on the border into Uzbekistan, they already having little amount of water for irrigation, and end of the Karakum River hasn't received water in the past several years.
How many years now would you say that crops are diminishing in Turkmenistan? I'm kind of curious.
I would say at least in the past 4 years. I mean, according to our reporters and according to our reports, in the past 4 years, we've been reporting that the wheat quota hasn't been fulfilled and cotton quota wasn't fulfilled, and that's partly responsible for the shortage of flour in Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan now has to import considerable amounts of wheat to satisfy the demand, like partially satisfy the demand at home.
Okay, thanks. And just one last question, and this is for both you and Alisher also. Any sign that the governments are making any efforts to prepare some of these communities that are at the, have been to, kind of the end of the line of this water system? The Amudarya does cross, ends up by the Uzbek-Turkmen border far north from Afghanistan. Are they taking any measures to get these communities ready for the fact that they might, in fact, have no possibility of remaining there if the water dries up? Farruh, start with you.
I mean, even if they are doing anything, we don't know because they don't make any public statements. And at the moment, what we hear from Turkmenistan, regarding the water problem is only from the farmers. The government, they always say, "Oh, we provide our farmers with enough water, with enough equipment and minerals." They always boast that the farmers have all the means to flourish, but which is not the case in reality. And from what we know from farmers, the government is not responding to their concerns.
Okay, thank you. Alisher, anything from the Uzbek side?
I mean, on the ground, the government already kind of tried to, but is it a response to Kostepa canal? But in general, there is a kind of a water saving technologies, kind of very slowly is being introduced, are being introduced. But apart from that, like specifically for Kostepa, I don't think they are there yet. So it's a big question. So of course it will depend how much water will be diverted. So initially it might be nearly like having non impact, no impact, but we don't know what will happen the years after that. So they still have some time to prepare, but the question is whether they de facto already acknowledged that there will be a canal, or still there are some hopes that this construction will somehow stalemate and will never be finished. So what Talibans are doing are basically, it's not like they lack water in that regions. These are the regions that historically didn't have water. So these are deserts mainly in Afghanistan, which were never cultivated. And as we know, like Afghanistan in general is not suffering from a huge water shortage since it's in a very mountainous region. So they might have a problem with managing the existing water rather than diverting a river to have their agriculture going. So kind of Uzbekistan is now in a crossroads, which way to go, whether we go and help them to make it properly and then try to put our leverage on this, or we just watch and see how it's gonna end. But the biggest puzzle is where the money come from for this canal. We know for sure that the whole project was offered by Russians, and however the financing of this canal is very untransparent. Some sources say that this is Emirates who sponsored this, but definitely it's a very expensive project. If it's done properly, of course.
Okay, thank you. And we've reached a halfway point in our discussion, so it's time for me to remind that this is the Majlis podcast, Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. We're talking about Central Asia's changing relationship with the Taliban, and joining me for this discussion are Farruh Yusupov, Director of RFARL's Turkmen Service, known locally as Asadlik; Alisher Sidikov, Director of RFARL's Uzbek Service, known locally as Azadlik; Salimjon Aioubov, Director of RFARL's Tajik Service, known locally as Azadi. Thank you again for being on the program. And Salimjon, I'm going to come back to you because we were noticing, now we see that there's some problems with Turkmenistan's and Uzbekistan's relationship with the Taliban. So it seems like the Taliban's relationship with the Tajik government is improving at least a little bit, but then again, there's some other problems too. The Taliban just said that the person that was responsible for killing its governor of Balkh province, which borders Uzbekistan, that among the people responsible were citizens of Tajikistan who'd been sent there. Any response from the Tajik government on this accusation?
So far, no response, no reactions. But Taliban are saying that those Tajik citizens are member of the Islamic State Khorasan, and that's the group that Tajikistan also afraid, at least Tajik government. So we are witnessing a kind of beginning of the softening of relations between Tajikistan and Taliban. At the same time, it's not happening by itself. Something is creating this situation, and some experts are saying that, for example, that it's for protection of national interests of Tajikistan, first. Secondly, because Tajikistan remained the only country in this front against Taliban for a long time. Even close neighbors didn't support Tajikistan in this position. And also, I met one interesting point on the Asia Plus that especially fingering on loyalists of Tajikistan in the front against Taliban, saying that, look, the United States, the Europe, and all other countries verbally are criticizing Taliban, but at the same time giving money and helping, negotiating to them. So this is one point. Second, Afghan embassy to Tajikistan and Khorog consulate are important from the very interesting point of view, because we have many leaders of the National Front led by Masood in Tajikistan, and the Ambassador Akbar have been always being mouthpiece of this front. If you remember, when Taliban visited Uzbekistan, they visited the embassy and said, look, all the people who had been working with the previous government, they will stay and they will continue their work. So in Tajikistan situation is completely different. But shortly, even if I think all what is going on in this region in the relationship between Central Asian countries and Taliban, when we are seeing problems ups and down, and now we have this canal situation. So it's looking like eventually they will be solved. They will be solved, and not without help or consultation of major partners of the Central Asian governments, Russia, China. Even in the case of the latest Taliban visit to Khorog, I heard that even Iranians were involved somehow, and it's because it's everything is going on to look in a larger context. The construction of the anti-American and anti-Western front in this region using Taliban, using relationship with Taliban is going on and growing. As Russia is losing in Ukraine, and China is in a difficult situation, awkward situation. So in this region, they are playing, I can say, very well.
No, just I wanted to ask one more other question too. You said that after they signed the electricity agreement, the Taliban and Tajikistan, they used the term softening of relations a little bit. There was a time when the Taliban stationed militants from Jamiat Ansarullah, which is a group that comes out of Tajikistan, Tajik citizens who have been fighting in Afghanistan for a long time. Are those troops still there, to the best of your knowledge, along the Tajik border?
Yes, but then they decreased in the number, and most importantly, all those groups, Jamaat Ansarullah and some other smaller groups, and even those who crossed the border during after the Taliban takeover after August 2021, they were consolidated in Tahrik Taliban Tajikistan in July 2022, and this was orchestrated by Taliban, and so it's a kind of a sign of strengthening control on all those groups, especially in terms of thinking any kind of action against Tajikistan. And probably we can just imagine that Taliban has done that and told the Tajik authorities that now they are in control and no one can pose any threat, but Tajikistan should give something in return. And now we can see the electricity agreement and the delegation visiting.
Okay, thanks. Sure. In relations between Uzbekistan and the Taliban, we know that actually Uzbekistan has probably the best relations of any of the Central Asian countries with the Taliban. It's kind of been leading such efforts as there have been regionally to engage with the Taliban. But there was an incident on the Paighambar Island last summer. Whatever happened with that?
There were a number of incidents like that. One of that was, accidental shelling of Uzbek cities, if you remember, the Termes, the neighboring city. Then there were some diplomatic row over railway, transit on railway transit when Uzbekistan shut the transit. Then there was an incident when Uzbekistan shut the electricity because it lacked electricity by its own. So there were things like that. But eventually they managed to work around these kind of edges, and Uzbekistan basically is trying to accept the de facto regime in Afghanistan and trying to not to escalate the situation. But as we see, Taliban is kind of trying to benefit from it, and the impression is that Uzbekistan is kind of preferring a rather weak peace, and rather than having kind of a conflict with its neighbor. So accepting that existence of de facto regime and actually calling international community to accept it, but there are kind of ramifications such as this canal or stuff. So because when Taliban began construction, they never consulted with Uzbekistan, for example. So, and they would never consult on other things, I believe. So that's where we remain, with Taliban.
So, Farruh, actually, it's over to you. There used to be problems along the Afghan-Turkmen border. Before the Taliban came to power. Have there been any incidents since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021?
Yes, there were a couple of incidents like shootings. There were unconfirmed reports that like small groups of armed people, and we don't know if they had any connection to Taliban, entered Turkmenistan in the Mari province, and they killed a couple of shepherds in Turkmenistan. And on the other hand, there were some cases when Turkmen border guards shot into Afghan territory and killed a couple of people there. and apparently those people were ethnic Turkmens. And as far as we were told, those ethnic Turkmens were trying to flee to Afghanistan, like they were fleeing for some unknown reason, and there were this kind of incidents. But before the Taliban took over, there were a couple of major incidents with dozens of Turkmen border guards being killed. But after August 2021, there were just smaller incidents, if you will, when there were casualties on both sides.
So, last question is just what level of engagement do the governments have with the Taliban at this moment? I mean, what have they discussed that are common points for them to have some kind of cooperation? I'll start with you, Farruh.
Yeah, from Turkmenistan's point of view, there is no the discussion apart from, the Turkmen government uses Taliban to remind of its TAPI project. From time to time, they say, "Oh, Taliban government is welcoming our efforts," and all this kind of rhetoric. And uh, Turkmen government is very wary of the Taliban and the threat that comes from Taliban, and they've been trying to appease Taliban, like as they did for many years. They send humanitarian aid, they send different kind of aid, and also they still sell electricity to Afghanistan. From Turkmenistan's point of view, it's mostly appeasing the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. That's the engagement.
Okay, thanks, Alisher. What about the Uzbek government and the Taliban? What's their relationship like? I mean, what things do they discuss when they get together? What's their common interests?
Yeah, I mean, they discuss primarily, the railroad situation. It's fully operated by Uzbek Railroad Company, and the transit, and also this kind of a exchange of some goods. Uzbekistan also offered to launch a school for Afghan women. So these kind of things, Uzbekistan, as you know, was praised for its efforts to help, to improve the situation with women in Afghanistan. So that's kind of one of the things they're doing, and of course, raising this concern on the top level, including President's daughter Saida Mirziayeva, also raised the concern about the plight of women in Afghanistan. So generally, what was very kind of funny and unwelcome in some sense when the Taliban delegation visited Uzbekistan last year, a huge crowd gathered around them, and prayed with them. So that's still like a mystery. Are they welcoming Taliban leadership, or they just were curious to see how these people look? So that's kind of the funny part of this. But in general, the connections are there. The new challenge with this canal is also there. So we will have to see how it will be resolved.
I just got to ask real quick: any sign of cooperation on the Islamic State of Khorasan, which tried to launch rockets into Uzbekistan a couple times from Afghan territory last year?
Whatever kind of concerned the security situation and security issues, this border is completely under the state security service. We almost never obtain any information about this kind of cooperation.
Okay, and then Salimjon, you get the last word. Also, and starting with the same point, the Islamic State of Khorasan has also launched rockets into Tajikistan last year, and of course they seem to be aiming a lot of propaganda out of Afghanistan at citizens inside Tajikistan. Any sign that the government, even unofficially in some way, has contacted the Taliban about dealing with Islamic State of Khorasan?
I think so, because if you remember when we discovered and published a story about how Taliban posted Ansarullah members at the border with Tajikistan. So there was a small negotiation between the two parts. I mean, Tajik border service and the Taliban from other side. So just to make sure that Ansarullah people will be sent to relocated to other places. But in general, in those relationships, I think the duality of the positions, both from Tajikistan towards Taliban and vice versa, this duality will be there always. It has always existed, and it will be continued, because there is a lot of topics to discuss between the two sides, but the main topic will be, of course, that Taliban will never rely on the Tajik government due what happened in the past, in previous tenure, and also because the Tajik government is always talking about ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. But but this duality will stay there, and it will be difficult for both sides to repair a relationship without a third party.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Well, we've run out of time. And of course, we can talk about this topic for hours and hours. And I'm sure I will have you all back on the show to talk about this topic again in the future. But for now, thank you, Alisher, and thank you, Salimjon, and thank you, Farruh, for being on the program. And a big thank you to Nathan Shoemaker, our producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder that you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you very much. Have a good week, and goodbye.